Oh hi, I'm the Heretic. The following video was brought to you by my patrons. Thank you for helping to support me and supporting the cause of liberty. Now, onto the video. Necromancy, or death magic, typically conjures up images of black-robed spellcasters reanimating the dead, either as guardians for their clandestine research into the so-called black arts to remain undisturbed, or to add their ranks to the army of the undead they're creating because they want to take over the world. Yeah, that's a totally plausible motivation for the main antagonists of a story that doesn't just completely dehumanize a character by eliminating all subtlety or nuance that might have motivated them to do what they did in the first place. He's just evil, okay? Stop asking questions. How do we know he's evil? Well, he's using necromancy, of course. But first, what is necromancy? It's a recurring element in fantasy settings. Warhammer, Dungeons & Dragons, Lord of the Rings, Elder Scrolls, you name it. Man waves his hand, speaks some Latin, and the skeletons go spooky. But is necromancy ethical or unethical? I've explained ethics before, but in a nutshell, any positive action has the potential to create victims. Any agent who initiates force against another agent always creates victims because it violates the self-ownership of the agent. Self-ownership is demonstrated through the dominion individuals exercise over their own bodies, which thus entitles them to the fruits of their labors. This is how we derive property rights. It sounds like I'm getting ahead of myself, but trust me, this will be important later. But right now, the question we're asking is if necromancy creates victims. First, we have to look at how necromancy works, but this is rather difficult because different fictional universes will have different rules for how magic works. In some settings, the most we see out of necromancy is simply raising the dead. Sometimes, necromancy can have other magical effects, such as causing living flesh to rot, inflicting people with exhaustion, healing flesh, or even communicating with the deceased. In fact, some of the earliest examples of fictional necromancy did exactly that. In the Odyssey, Odysseus used the ancient Greek ritual of Nikaia to conjure dead spirits. Nikaia being a ritual to, conjure dead spirits and ask them about the future. Hell, the Greeks had ritual sites such as the Necromantean dedicated specifically to doing this. Of course, these aren't all the magical effects that could be described as necromancy, but here we start to run into some problems. There is no objective way to define what necromancy is. Different settings will define different magical effects as necromancy. In the earliest editions of Dungeons & Dragons, True Resurrection was considered a necromancy spell. In 3rd edition, it became a conjuration spell. Now in 5th edition, it's necromancy again. Defining necromancy is tricky to say the least, and there will no doubt be effects that would arguably be described as necromancy that would be left out or even should, but are included. For the sake of argument, let's define 2 necromantic effects: speaking with the dead, as with the ancient Greeks, and reanimating corpses, the contemporary and most iconic use of death magic. In most fictional settings, necromancy is despised. Arguments for this range from it being a perversion of the natural order, a violation of the sanctity of death, or otherwise involved in the creation of what are described as unholy abominations. Suffice to say, fiction writers aren't philosophers. Now sometimes this is played with, necromancy being a legitimized or even celebrated school of magic, necromancers being anti-heroes or even straight heroes. But there really isn't a lot of answers here, just bromides and opinions. With the principles I'll be talking about, you should be able to figure out whether or not any arguably necromantic effect, or hell, any magic at all, is ethical. So first we need to establish who the victim is. When a necromancer communicates with a dead guy, who is being harmed? The only victim I can conceive of is the spirits themselves. For the spirit to be in any way useful, presumably, it would have to be a moral agent, possessing the same rights and autonomy that any other person has. A tree can't be a victim, since it lacks free will or agency. As such, spirits of the dead can be victims, but are they? Communicating with the dead could be just like giving them a phone call. Sure, in some circumstances it can be annoying, but you're not victimizing them by ringing them up, as they can choose not to answer. This, by itself, does not create victims. It's completely harmless, and thus is completely ethical. Now, if the dead are forced into communicating with the living, and can only return to the afterlife once the necromancer is satisfied, then yes, it's unethical. Not because it's necromancy, but because the magic is being used for kidnapping. This is actually pretty straightforward. Whether it's a kidnapping or interrogation, or just a supernatural Skype call, we can determine its ethics by what is happening and if there are victims. Now let's go into the fun stuff. The great undead scourges that ravage the countryside. What I just described constitutes war, and the destruction of property, which is unethical. This shouldn't be controversial, as it's no different than a conquering army using scorched earth tactics. But suppose you're just a small-time necromancer who wants to raise the dead to do things that aren't unethical. I don't know, dig holes. Would raising the dead to dig holes be unethical? The question is, again, who are the victims? Who owns the bodies? Since the body's former user can no longer demonstrate agency, after all they're dead, the deceased cannot be defined as the legitimate owner. If we are to argue that the dead can still be legitimate owners, how can we contract with them? Who is their representative? How long do the dead retain ownership over their former property? Demonstrably, it cannot be done. And even if you could use your supernatural Skype call to contact the dead and presumably contract with them, well, the dead still are not able to interact with the world of the living through their own agency. So they can't defend what they would claim to be their property. One alternative is that some community owns the dead. But here, we have the same problem with any other concept of communal property. Group rights cannot be demonstrated to exist. Groups do not have any agency beyond their constituent individuals that make it up, nor do they have the self-ownership that enables individuals to exercise exclusivity and dominion over certain things. So by default, the dead, and by extension their stuff, is unowned. As such, it is legitimate to homestead a corpse, as grisly as that sounds. A real-world equivalent would be archaeology. Who owns the artifacts and historical sites dug up around the world? Presumably someone at some point owned them, but their legitimate owners have been dead for a long time. Who is to say what is an evil grave robber and what is an academic archaeologist? Well, the answer is actually pretty simple. A corpse can be owned by next of kin. A family can own a gravesite, a mausoleum, the cremation urn, anywhere the remains are placed. If necromancy, that is to say reanimating the dead, is unethical, it is only because that in order to get the corpse, they would need to violate the property rights of the remains' present and living owner. But an unowned corpse's reanimation creates no victims. Nobody is harmed. Magic is a tool. It has no will or agency of its own, and can neither be good nor evil. It's like a hammer. While a hammer can be used to cave someone's skull in, an act that's uncontroversially unethical, the hammer itself cannot do so on its own. It's entirely the responsibility of the moral agent, the man who wields it, whether it is used for ethical or unethical purposes. Necromancy is no more evil than that man. Such is the same way with any magic user. Electromancers can use their powers to zap people to death or to power people's homes. Force users can help or they can hurt people. We don't need medieval kings to help us figure this out. Questions, comments, critique? If you could have magic powers, what would you do with them? What do you think about necromancy? Leave a comment below. Support me on Patreon. Like, share, and subscribe to become a heretic today.